want to talk to you today about the flight response. And this is one of the four F's: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And I want to talk to you about it in terms of how it can show up in unexpected ways that might look nothing like running or fleeing from a wild animal. It's like these trauma responses are sometimes more ingrained into our lives. And when you don't have context for it, you may be living in a trauma response, sometimes for years, and not recognizing that that's what it is, and trying to do other things that are just not effective or successful at managing that thing because you haven't recognized it as a trauma response. So it's a coping mechanism that your brain and your body developed that is designed to keep you safe in danger. But when you are experiencing chronic PTSD, it's something that even long after you are out of the danger, you may still have these responses. And so learning how to regulate your nervous system and move past the coping mechanisms that are really designed for those situations where you are in danger, moving past that and being able to live in a way that is safer and more freeing is something that I'm working on personally. Having experienced years of abuse and trauma, not so much as a child, but as an adult, it's something that I'm now that I have left a cult a year ago, recovering from that, which is a long process. So, okay. And maybe we don't ever fully recover. I'm not convinced that there is a end state where you're like, that's it, I'm done. So, okay. So we're talking about flight. I want to give you one example. This happened recently, actually, with this guy who wants to come up. Okay. So I took him to the dog park. He is a little fluffy thing, but he thinks he's a big, scary thing. And sometimes he picks on big, actual scary dogs. And that's what he did at the dog park. And he was on a leash, and the giant dog was not on the leash, and he got attacked. He's fine, as you can see. But I had to actually physically pull him out of the jaws of a vicious attacking dog. And like my kids were there, they were tangled up in the leash. Like it was probably like only milliseconds, but it felt like this eternity of like, very scary thing happening. And I'm pulling him out of the dog, screaming, no, no, there's people all around trying to come and help. They got the dog away. And I grabbed the kids, I grabbed the dogs, and I just ran. I was like, go. Like, even though the dog was secured and the owner's coming after me, like, oh, I'm sorry, are you okay? And I'm just like, all I was seeing was the car and get there as fast as I can. So that is how we typically see a flight response. It's appropriate. Like, I wanted my kids, myself, and my dogs to get to safety as fast as possible. Flee. So that's flight. I think we can all relate to that. We all understand that. That's a physical safety issue. It makes sense. However, the way this shows up in a more chronic, less life or death situation can be really tricky. And what I'm just learning about this is really interesting because I'm like, oh, okay, wow, that's flight too. So if you're not running from a vicious dog, you might be trying to outrun internal discomfort. So, and that can be triggers. So if you've experienced trauma, you will know that there will be certain things that will trigger some of that, abuse or trauma. So, and that can be, it can be a balloon popping, or it can be someone saying something critical to you, or it could be whatever your triggers are. In order to avoid the triggers, you can quote, outrun them. That's also a flight response. That can look like compulsive productivity. That's really interesting. It can be like, okay, so when we feel this compulsion to achieve something, like getting another degree, getting a raise, getting a different position, but it's not coming from like, yeah, that would be great. I feel really great about myself. It's like a need, it's a compulsion, having to do that, or else we're just not okay. right? Think about that you're actually like creating those milestones and achieving them from a place that's really unhealthy. Like you're outrunning a discomfort that's inside. I never thought about that before. I never had heard that before. And I'm re-looking at like all the things that I have chosen to accomplish or do in my life, and like how much of that was like a true just desire, or was it this need and this compulsive need to achieve, which is actually a flight response. Staying in perpetual motion. So not being still, not being okay, stopping, like having to produce, having to be the best, and not being okay if we're not. And it's not so much about the outcome or the end result as it is about the striving for something. So, same thing when you're like, if I just could have a new car, or if I just had lost 50 pounds, or if I just got the right man or whatever. And it's like you do that and it doesn't give you that sense of happiness or fulfillment that we thought. It's the same thing with this, where we think like, okay, you're outrunning this internal thing that says I'm not good enough. If I do better, if I do more, then I will be, then I will be. But it's the striving. It's the striving for that's actually that trauma response, that flight. And you won't be okay until you stop and you actually go inside. And that's the that's the sucky part, because in the cult I was in, and a lot of self-help and things, is actually like this real motivational, inspirational, like feel good instantly, be your best self, whatever. And you're actually doing spiritual bypass, which is, you can check out, I have another video on that, but it's like you're not actually looking at the issue, you're going around it, because it feels better. You're distracting, you're dissociating, you're bypassing. And doing this real trauma work, getting in touch with your real true self, is hard. It is not something that is that picture at the top of the mountain with the hand up, like, yeah. It's like, it's the dark, dank cellar basement of yuck, and the thing is that it is actually where the true safety is when you work through that stuff. So it is worth it. And I'm in the middle of it. So I feel like I'm getting through, I'm getting better, but there's a lot of hard days. Okay. So I want to also not forget to mention Pete Walker wrote a book called Complex PTSD: From Surviving to Thriving. I'm going to link to a podcast that is called The Fourth F, Fawning, with Dr. Ingrid Clayton, and it's on Mark Vicente's podcast, which I love. And that is really good. About an hour in, they talk about this. Okay, so the flight trauma response is an adaptive coping mechanism that we learn as children, or in my case, an adult, when our environment isn't fully safe. So we learn by becoming hypervigilant to the environment to see when we might have to leave. If you grew up with a parent that had an explosive temper, or were chaotic, or were emotionally absent, we learn unconsciously that life just isn't safe. And because it's not safe, we create coping mechanisms to allow us to avoid life, or to be able to flee at a moment's notice. Many workaholics or overachievers are rewarded for their flight trauma response because it creates great results in business. Isn't that great? Yet they're resentful, burnout, and disillusioned with their work. And at the same time, they need that work to feel at home and to have that pseudo safety net. When it comes to relationships, flight can look like one foot out the door, or always bring up ending or leaving, like always talking about like, well, let's just break up, or, I'll just leave. Being stuck in a flight trauma response is misdiagnosed as social anxiety often, or any kind of chronic anxiety, and it can also cause panic attacks. Another interesting thing about flight is perfectionism. So having, or altruism even. It's like having this need, a compulsive need to make something perfect is an avoidance or an outrunning internally of that discomfort, that thing that comes up when you aren't doing the perfecting activity. It's like, okay, this has to be perfect. This has to be perfect. Otherwise, I'm not good enough. Otherwise, what is all of that stuff that means to you? And the altruism thing, they brought that up on the Mark Vicente podcast. And he's like, do you think that I was like in this flight response for years trying to make the world a better place? And feeling the feelings that come up when I'm not making the world a better place and doing activism and all of this is like guilt and feeling selfish. And so Ingrid Clayton says part of our work is to learn to tolerate those bad feelings rather than staying in perpetual motion and outrunning them. So flight trauma response can look like chronic rushing or always going, feeling uncomfortable or even panic when you stay still, spending energy micromanaging people and situations, having a history of abruptly ending relationships or a phobia of commitment, feeling trapped easily, making plans to avoid any downtime or throwing yourself into work or achievement, and often can be presenting as anxiety or panic attacks. So, how do we heal from this response? So, it's about finding safety and stillness and presence. So, this can look like spending a few minutes each morning in stillness or journaling. I say that with a caveat because mantras and meditations can be used in some cults as a thought control technique or a thought stopping technique, in which case you don't want to do that because this will be triggering for you and it may cause you to dissociate. So if you were in, I know a lot of my viewers were in cults, and your cult leader, maybe it was a yoga thing or it was a self-help thing, and you used a lot of repetitive statements or mantras, or the meditation you used was designed to basically bypass or make you dissociate, that we don't want to do anything like that because it's just going to be triggering. However, find a way that you can be still, whether that's walking. I know walking is not still, but still in your head. Breathing or whatever that is, journaling is really good. Turning down an invite while also not making another plan. So saying no to doing something, but not having to fill that space with something else. Taking time to journal your own values and beliefs. Letting your partner in on the trauma response and how it presents. So if you are someone who's always got one foot out the door, sharing this can be really helpful and say, when I get scared, I tend to flee or self-isolate, and I could use your reassurance. So letting them in on what's going on so that they don't take it personally. Movement. The body is dealing with adrenaline and cortisol, so you need an outlet for those stress hormones that feels good for you. And remembering that flight is a pattern. There's not something that's wrong with you or with it. It's a trauma response, and it's simply revealing the conditioning underlying that. So hopefully this helps give you some context to the complexity of trauma responses and how they can show up in your relationships and at work. It doesn't have to be that you are physically being threatened, like in the dog attack scenario. It can definitely be more subtle than that. But understanding that it is a trauma response and seeking out a trauma-informed therapist to work on it may save you a lot of stress and self-flagellation when you aren't able to cope with some of these things, because a lot of them are really socially rewarded. It's like achievement and productivity. No one is going to see that in you and go like, oh, you are in an active trauma response, we should stop. They'll reward you. They say, oh my gosh, you're such a great worker. You're so smart. You're so accomplished. But if it's coming from this internal outrunning of discomfort, it's not going to actually benefit you. You're not going to feel good doing it. Or when you've achieved whatever you're achieving, you're just going to continue striving. And that's why it can jump to different things in different scenarios, because it's actually a coping mechanism. It's not about the thing that you're striving for, it's about the striving.